Today we're going to talk about a story from the Bible that if you have ever been a child in Sunday school, or if you have ever taught children in Sunday school, then you are familiar with this story, because this is the story of Jonah, a very popular story for children, but not really a children's story, like most of the stories in the Bible. This is the way the story starts. God came to Jonah, this person about whom we know very little, and said, I want you to go to Nineveh, and I want you to represent me there. Now, Nineveh was not a place where Jonah wanted to go. The Ninevites were not friends of his. They were not people that he wanted to bring God's word to. He didn't have any interest in going to Nineveh. And so at the very beginning of this book, we are told that Jonah decided to go in exactly the opposite direction. Instead of being at kind of the eastern end of the Mediterranean Ocean where Nineveh was, he went all the way, or intended to at least, to the other end of the Mediterranean Sea. Right at the beginning of the book, it tells us 3 times in a row that Jonah, instead of doing what God intended for him to do, that is to go to Nineveh, that Jonah went to Tarshish, went to Tarshish, went to Tarshish. He went far away from what God intended for him to do. But this is what happened on Jonah's trip to try to get to Tarshish. He got on a ship and was going as a passenger on this ship to go there to the western end of the Mediterranean Sea. But as he was sleeping down in the hold, a great storm arose. The sailors on this ship, who sailed in that ocean all the time, were very afraid. It was such a bad storm. They began throwing things over the side of the ship to try and lighten the load, to try and keep the ship afloat. They began praying to the gods whom they worshipped, trying to get the storm to stop, but nothing would stop. So they went down into the hold and they found Jonah, who had already told them that he was trying to escape from what his God wanted him to do. They found Jonah and they said, "Wake up! How can you sleep? We're in the middle of a storm. At least come up onto the deck and pray to your God. Perhaps we will then be saved." So Jonah went with them up onto the deck. The sailors said to him, "By the way, who is your God? Who do you worship?" Jonah said, "Well, I happen to worship the God who created the whole world, including this ocean." Then the sailors really were afraid. They began to decide that maybe it was because Jonah was running away from God that this storm had come up. And they began to debate among themselves whether they would be punished if they threw him over the side, if they killed him in order to save themselves. Jonah relieved their fears. He said, "That's okay, I know this is my fault," and he went over the side of the boat. Now, if the story ended there, it wouldn't be as interesting to children. It wouldn't be the thing that we love to teach in Sunday school so much, but you remember what happened. God was not done with Jonah yet, because when Jonah went over the side of the boat, there was a great fish, not a whale, a great fish waiting for him there, who swallowed Jonah up. And for 3 days and 3 nights, Jonah lived in the belly of that fish. Jonah prayed a long, heartfelt prayer to God from the belly of that fish. And after 3 days, the fish swam over to the shore and kind of burped Jonah out onto the shore. So there he was, back where he had started, back where God had first spoken to him. Remember, God wasn't done with Jonah yet. And so God came to Jonah again and said, "Jonah, really, I really want you to go to Nineveh." This time Jonah must have decided, well, I already tried to get away once. I've spent 3 days in the belly of a fish. I might as well go to Nineveh. Jonah didn't want these people to know who God was. Jonah didn't want these people to be saved. He didn't want their lives to be changed because they knew about God. But by this time he figured there was no escape. And so he trudged to Nineveh, the great city of Nineveh. We're told it was so large that it would take 3 days to walk from one side of the city to the other. We're also told that Jonah walked 1 day into the city. He didn't even make his way all the way into the center of the city. He just kind of strolled in there, got partway into the city, and preached the worst sermon ever preached. Basically, he said, well, If you want to, you could change, and maybe God would save you. It may have been the worst sermon ever preached as far as the preacher was concerned. But as far as the listeners were concerned, it was a great sermon. Immediately, they tore their clothes. They put on sackcloth and ashes. They called a fast. They realized they needed to change how they acted and who they were because of who God was. The king of Nineveh even heard about this and declared that there must be a fast. He tore his own clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes. And because the people changed in response to God's word to them, they were saved. Not what Jonah had intended. Now, this is a good story for us to remember at this time of year in most churches' lives, because most pastors and sessions and Sunday school teachers and other leaders in churches hope that within the next few weeks, the kind of doldrums of summer will turn around, that the low attendance you might have noticed in the last few weeks will begin to end, that when children go back to school and Sunday school starts up and all of the things begin to happen in churches again, that people will just appear out of the woodwork and will come back and populate all of those things that are so important to you. But the story of Jonah reminds us of something that is at the heart of our Reformed faith. That's called the priesthood of all believers. Jonah did not want to go to Nineveh. Jonah wasn't particularly good as an evangelist, and yet God used Jonah anyway, just as God uses each one of us. So in these next few weeks, as you begin to gear up again at your church, remember, it is not your pastor's job alone to be sure that people come to church. It is not your session's job alone to be sure that people do that. It is your job too, because you are an evangelist. You are a person who has been called by God to share the good news of who Jesus Christ is and what a difference he can make in our lives. So when your friends and your neighbors ask you what you're going to do this weekend, remember to tell them that you're going to church and tell them why. Brag about your church. Tell them about the wonderful things that happen there. And especially be sure to help them to understand that you are a new person, a different person, because you have responded to God's love in Jesus Christ.